It started with a receipt I found while cleaning out his jacket pocket. I wasn't snooping, at least not intentionally. I had grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, where he always lazily tossed it after work, planning to hang it up properly. But as I shook it out, a neatly folded slip of paper floated to the floor. Curious, I bent to pick it up, not expecting much. What I found stopped me cold. It was from a high-end jewelry store downtown. The name of the store gleamed on the paper, a stark reminder of the extravagance it represented. A diamond necklace, no less, an amount so significant that it made my stomach churn. My first instinct was confusion, followed quickly by a flicker of excitement. Was this for me? Had he finally planned a surprise? After all, we'd been married for 10 years, and though life had dulled the edges of romance, we weren't unhappy, or so I thought. I folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into my pocket. My mind raced with possibilities as I went about the rest of the day, the image of that necklace shimmering in my thoughts. When he came home, I couldn't stop myself from studying him, searching for signs. Was he hiding something? His kiss on my cheek felt perfunctory, his smile distant. But wasn't that just how things were lately? The second clue came a few days later when another slip of paper found its way into my hands. This time it was for flowers, an extravagant bouquet of roses. Again, my heart leapt with anticipation. Maybe he was planning something big, an anniversary celebration, even though it wasn't the right time of year. Maybe he decided we needed to rekindle the spark. I wanted to believe it so badly, but something felt off. The purchases didn't match his usual behavior. He wasn't secretive or nervous. If anything, he seemed distracted, as if his mind was always somewhere else. And then there were the late nights at the office. Too many reports piling up, he'd say. His phone buzzing incessantly with calls and texts he rarely explained. I brushed it off because I trusted him. We had built a life together, shared laughter, tears, dreams. That trust was the foundation of everything. Until it wasn't. The truth unraveled in pieces, like a thread pulling loose from a carefully woven tapestry. It was one of his colleagues who let it slip unintentionally. We were at a company event, and she mentioned how much Melissa had been helping him lately. "Oh, she's been a lifesaver," the woman said casually, sipping her wine. "Staying late to get those reports in order. You should be proud of how much she's stepping up for him." Melissa, his secretary. I smiled politely, but inside something cracked. Late nights? Staying late for him? My stomach turned. I replayed the past few weeks in my mind, the receipts, the distractions, the excuses. A sense of dread settled over me like a heavy fog, suffocating and inescapable. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, I took his phone from the nightstand. My hand shook as I scrolled through the messages. I didn't want to do this. I hated myself for invading his privacy. But I couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion clawing at my heart. The messages confirmed everything. They weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. The tone of familiarity, the inside jokes, the way he thanked her for all her help. And then there it was, a photo of the diamond necklace. "Hope you love this as much as I loved picking it out for you," he'd written. Her reply was a row of heart emojis, followed by, "You're too good to me, red heart." I felt the air leave my lungs. My hands went numb, and I nearly dropped the phone. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a momentary lapse, a fleeting indiscretion. It was deliberate, calculated. He had taken the time to choose gifts for her, to shower her with affection that he no longer spared for me. The worst part wasn't even the cheating. It was the realization that he had been giving away parts of himself that I thought were mine. His thoughtfulness, his attention, his care. All of it had been redirected to someone else, leaving me with scraps. When I confronted him the next morning, I didn't yell. I didn't throw things or scream, even though every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I stood in the kitchen with the receipts in my hand and asked him one simple question. "Who are these for?" His face turned pale. He tried to deny it at first, stumbling over his words, but I could see the guilt written all over him. Finally, he confessed. "Melissa has been helping me a lot lately," he mumbled, as if that justified everything. I wanted to show her my appreciation. Appreciation. My voice cracked. "You bought her jewelry. Flowers. Do you have any idea how that feels, knowing you've given her more thought than you've given me in months? Years." He stammered, tried to apologize, but the damage was done. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on me, threatening to crush the life out of me. I couldn't even cry. The pain was too raw, too deep. In the days that followed, I packed a bag and left. I needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out what came next. He begged me to stay, promised it was over with her, swore he'd do anything to make it right. But how do you rebuild trust when it's been shattered into a million pieces? How do you find your way back to someone who's given parts of himself to someone else? I don't know if our marriage can survive this. Maybe it's too late. Or maybe, like that diamond necklace, our relationship was beautiful on the surface but flawed at its core, destined to break. I spent the first few nights at a friend's house, sleeping in a guest room that smelled faintly of lavender and detergent, the kind of neutral, comforting scent that made me feel like I could exhale without breaking into sobs. Sarah didn't ask too many questions, which was exactly what I needed. She simply poured me a glass of wine, sat beside me on the couch, and let me unravel the mess in my own time. The words felt foreign and bitter as I explained everything, finding the receipts, connecting the dots, his half-hearted confessions. She listened with a furrowed brow, her hands clenched tightly around her mug of tea. When I finally fell silent, drained and raw, she leaned back and sighed. "I hate to say this," she began cautiously, "but you need to figure out what you really want. Not just for him to apologize or explain himself, but for yourself. Can you forgive him? Do you even want to?" I didn't know how to answer that. The idea of forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb. Yet, the thought of letting go of 10 years of my life, of the home we'd built, the memories we'd shared, it was equally unthinkable. How do you decide between holding on to something broken and walking away from something familiar? The following day, I found myself sitting in a park a few blocks from Sarah's house. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and children played in the distance, their laughter ringing out like tiny bells. I watched them absent-mindedly, my mind spinning in circles. Every time I thought about confronting him again, my chest tightened. I didn't want to hear more excuses or empty promises. I wanted answers, real ones. I wanted to understand how he could do this to us, to me. Did he even love me anymore? Or had I just become part of the scenery, a comfortable fixture in the background of his life? Later that evening, I decided to return home, not to reconcile, but to confront the mess head-on. When I opened the door, the house felt eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. His eyes shot up when he saw me, relief flashing across his face. "You're back," he said softly, as though he were afraid to speak too loudly. "For now," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I dropped my bag by the door and crossed my arms. "We need to talk. Really talk." He nodded, gesturing for me to sit, but I stayed standing. I wanted the upper hand, even if it was just a small psychological advantage. "I want to know everything," I said firmly. "No lies. No omissions. If there's any chance of salvaging this, I need the truth." He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, I thought he was going to lie again, to feed me another carefully crafted half-truth. But then his shoulders sagged, and the words came tumbling out. "She was just there," he said, his voice strained. "I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth. I've been stressed, overwhelmed, and Melissa. She made me feel like I wasn't failing at everything." "Failing?" I shot back, anger bubbling to the surface. "You think buying her jewelry and flowers makes you less of a failure? Do you even hear yourself?" He flinched, and for a moment, I saw something like shame flicker across his face. "It wasn't supposed to be anything serious," he muttered. "It was just, I don't know, a distraction." "A distraction," I repeated, the words tasting sour in my mouth. "You destroyed my trust for a distraction. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us?" He didn't respond, just sat there staring at the table. The silence was deafening. In the days that followed, the house became a battlefield of unspoken words and simmering tension. I couldn't look at him without feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He tried, in his own clumsy way, to make amends, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, leaving little notes that I barely glanced at. None of it felt real. It was like he was trying to patch up a shattered vase with tape, and hoping I wouldn't notice the cracks. One evening, after another failed attempt at conversation, I found myself sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. An ad popped up for couples therapy, And before I could talk myself out of it, I clicked the link and filled out the inquiry form. When I told him about it the next morning, he seemed genuinely surprised. "You're willing to try?" he asked, his voice tinged with something like hope. "I don't know if it'll work," I admitted. "But if there's any chance of fixing this, we need help. We can't do it alone." Therapy was brutal. Sitting across from a stranger and airing out the darkest corners of our marriage felt like peeling off layers of skin, raw and vulnerable. The therapist didn't let him off the hook, pressing him to dig deeper into why he'd strayed. She didn't let me off the hook either, challenging me to confront my own feelings of neglect and resentment that I hadn't even realized I'd buried. Over time, the sessions became less about assigning blame and more about understanding. It wasn't easy. Some days I left feeling more broken than when I'd walked in. But slowly, piece by piece, we began to rebuild not just our relationship but ourselves. I'm not naive enough to think everything is fixed. There are still moments when I see his phone light up and feel a pang of anxiety, wondering who's on the other end. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying the hurt in my mind. But there are also moments of genuine connection, glimmers of the love we used to share. I don't know what the future holds for us. Maybe we'll make it through this stronger and more honest than before. Or maybe we won't. But for now, I'm willing to try. And that, I think, is enough. The days stretched into weeks, and life began to take on a strange duality. On the surface, everything appeared to be moving forward. We still shared meals, albeit in tense silence. We still spoke, though our conversations felt hollow, a shadow of what they once were. Yet beneath it all, the fracture between us remained. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the gnawing ache in my chest, the constant reminder of what he had done. I threw myself into work, hoping the chaos of deadlines and meetings would drown out the noise in my head. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I offered only vague excuses about being tired or overwhelmed. It wasn't a lie exactly, just a sanitized version of the truth. In the evenings, I stayed late at the office or took long walks through the neighborhood, anything to avoid coming home to the stifling tension of our house. He too seemed to be walking on eggshells. His attempts at reconciliation became more cautious, as though he were afraid of pushing me too far. The flowers started arriving, ironic given the context. At first I wanted to throw them away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. They sat on the counter, bright and beautiful, a painful reminder of how easily gestures could lose their meaning. The turning point came on a Saturday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, when he walked in holding an envelope. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it in front of me. "What's this?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Something I should have done a long time ago," he said softly. Inside was a handwritten letter. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper and began to read. It was a confession, raw and unfiltered. He wrote about the guilt he'd been carrying, the shame that had kept him awake at night. He admitted that he had taken me for granted, that he had been selfish and thoughtless. But more than that, he wrote about his fear of losing me, of facing the emptiness he had created in our lives. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. I looked up at him, searching for some sign that this wasn't another ploy, another empty promise. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in months, I saw something that resembled honesty. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. "I don't even know if I deserve it. But I love you and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right, even if it means letting you go." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. For a long moment I didn't respond. I simply sat there, staring at him, trying to reconcile the man before me with the one who had hurt me so deeply. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try. Not for you, for me. Because if I don't, this pain will consume me." From that day forward, things began to change slowly and painfully. We kept going to therapy, peeling back layers of hurt and resentment that had accumulated over the years. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything we had buried, the wounds we had ignored. I discovered that I had been holding on to my own grudges, small moments of neglect that had festered in the quiet corners of my heart. There were setbacks, of course, moments when the anger resurfaced, when a careless word or a misplaced gesture reopened the wounds. But there were also moments of clarity, of connection. One night, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, he reached for my hand. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then I let him take it, and the warmth of his touch was enough to make me cry. Months passed, and the pieces of our lives began to fit together again, though not in the same way. The cracks were still there, visible if you looked closely enough. But they didn't feel like weaknesses anymore. They felt like reminders of how far we had come, of the strength it took to rebuild. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, he turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "I know it's not enough," he said, "but I want to thank you for giving me a second chance. I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that it was worth it." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. He wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But neither was I. "Just don't make me regret it," I said finally, my voice steady but soft. He nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed him. Our life didn't magically go back to the way it was before. In some ways it never would. But we found a new rhythm, one that felt more honest, more real. There were no more secrets, no more late nights or unexplained absences. And slowly, tentatively, I began to trust him again. Looking back now, I'm not sure if forgiveness is ever complete. There are still moments when the memories creep in, when the doubts whisper in the back of my mind. But those moments are fleeting, overshadowed by the life we've built together since. I don't know what the future holds for us. Maybe we'll face more challenges, more heartbreak. But for now we're here together, and that feels like enough. As the months stretched into a year, our life together slowly began to stabilize, though the specter of what had happened lingered like a shadow at the edge of every moment. I couldn't say that I fully trusted him yet. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild overnight. But I found myself leaning into the present more than the past. Each day felt like a small test, a cautious step forward on fragile ground. We continued therapy, not because we were still in crisis, but because it became a space where we could be brutally honest in ways that were sometimes harder at home. The therapist helped us understand the patterns we'd fallen into long before the affair, how years of small, unspoken frustrations had hardened into distance. It was painful to admit how complicit I'd been in letting us drift apart. While nothing excused his betrayal, I realized that ignoring my own unhappiness had created cracks in our foundation that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. But it wasn't just about unpacking the past. It was about finding new ways to connect, ways to make each other feel seen again. For a while it felt awkward, like trying to dance to a song you'd forgotten the steps to. Date nights felt contrived, forced, and there were moments I wanted to abandon the whole effort. Yet there were also glimmers of something real. A shared laugh over an inside joke, the warmth of his hand brushing mine as we walked through the park, the comfort of falling asleep beside him and feeling, just for a moment, safe again. One evening he surprised me with dinner reservations at a small Italian restaurant we used to frequent when we first started dating. When we walked in, I was overwhelmed by the familiar scent of garlic and fresh bread, the sound of soft music playing in the background. For a moment it felt like stepping into a time capsule, a glimpse of a simpler, happier version of us. "I thought we could use a reminder," he said as we sat down, his voice tentative, as if afraid I might reject the gesture. I smiled, touched by the effort. "It's perfect," I said, and for the first time in a long while I meant it. The evening was light, easy. We talked about nothing and everything, the kind of conversations we hadn't had in years. By the time we left, hand in hand, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step closer to it. As time went on, the milestones became less dramatic but no less significant. The first time I didn't feel the urge to check his phone. The first time I went a full day without thinking about the betrayal. The first time I genuinely laughed at one of his jokes without the bitterness of the past clouding the moment. Each step was small, almost imperceptible, but they added up piece by piece until the life we were building began to feel like ours again. We started talking about the future, cautiously at first. Vacations we wanted to take, projects around the house we wanted to tackle, dreams we'd put on hold for too long. For the first time in years, it felt like we were looking forward instead of back. One afternoon, as we were cleaning out the attic, I found an old box of letters we'd written to each other during our early years together. I sat on the floor, flipping through them, overwhelmed by the raw, unfiltered love captured in those pages. "Remember these?" I asked, holding up one of the letters. He smiled, sitting down beside me. How could I forget? I used to spend hours trying to get the words just right. I handed him one of the letters and we sat there reading in silence, the weight of our shared history settling around us like a warm blanket. In that moment I realized something profound. While the pain of the past would always be a part of our story, it didn't have to define it. We were more than the mistakes we'd made. As the weeks turned into months, life began to feel normal again, though it was a new kind of normal. There were still moments of doubt, flashes of hurt that crept in when I least expected them. But they were fleeting, replaced more often than not by a quiet sense of hope. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to me with a look of quiet determination. I know I've said this before, but thank you, he said, for staying, for giving us another chance. I don't take it lightly, and I never will. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. The words I wanted to say felt too big, too complicated, but I knew he understood. That night, as we lay in bed, I thought about how far we'd come. The road ahead wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was ours. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a destination. It wasn't something you woke up one day and decided you were ready to give. It was a process, a series of choices made day by day, moment by moment. And in choosing to forgive, I was choosing myself, choosing to let go of the anger and pain that had weighed me down for so long. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that, I thought, was enough. The years rolled on, and with them came a kind of quiet transformation, both within myself and within us as a couple. The rawness of what had happened dulled over time, fading like an old scar, still visible if you looked closely, but no longer painful to the touch. Our life together began to take on a rhythm again. Not like before, but in a way that felt more deliberate, more intentional. We weren't the same people we'd been at the start of our marriage, and in some ways that was a gift. I learned to let go of the constant need to monitor his actions, to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the doubts crept in, whispering insidious questions I couldn't silence. But those moments became fewer and farther between, replaced by a tentative confidence in the life we were rebuilding. Trust wasn't something that had magically reappeared. It was something we constructed brick by brick, through every small action, every moment of openness and honesty. He changed too. I saw it in the way he made an effort to be present, not just physically but emotionally. He started asking questions about my day, listening to the answers with a focus that hadn't been there before. He remembered the little things like how I preferred my coffee or the way I liked the curtains drawn just so in the evenings. These weren't grand gestures. They were subtle shifts, quiet reminders that he was paying attention, that I mattered. Our therapy sessions gradually became less frequent, transitioning from a lifeline to something more like maintenance, a check-in to ensure we were staying on the right path. The therapist encouraged us to set goals, not just as a couple but individually. It was during one of these sessions that I realized how much of myself I had lost over the years, not just because of his betrayal but because I had spent so much of our marriage prioritizing us over me. For the first time in years, I started to think about what I wanted, not as a wife but as a person. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since college. At first it felt strange, almost indulgent, to carve out time just for myself. But as the colors spread across the canvas, I felt a part of myself come alive that I'd almost forgotten existed. He noticed too, and instead of resenting the time I spent away from him, he encouraged it. "You're amazing," he said one evening, standing behind me as I worked on a piece. His hands rested lightly on my shoulders, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I can't believe you stopped doing this for so long. I guess I forgot how much I loved it," I admitted, glancing up at him. "Well, don't stop again," he said, leaning down to kiss the top of my head. Moments like that became the new foundation of our relationship. Small, sincere acts of support and love. They weren't about grand apologies or making up for the past. They were about building something better, something real. We started traveling more, something we'd always talked about but had never prioritized. Our first trip was to the mountains, a quiet getaway where we spent hours hiking trails and sitting by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. There was something healing about being away from the familiar, about stepping outside the routines and spaces that had once held so much tension. On one of those hikes, as we stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast valley below, he turned to me with a serious expression. "I know I'll never deserve what you've given me," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you thought I was when we first met." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. The wind whipped around us, carrying away the words I might have said. But in that moment, I didn't need to say anything. We stood there in silence together, and it was enough. As the years passed, the pain of what had happened became more like a distant memory, something that no longer defined us but instead served as a reminder of how far we'd come. There were still moments when it resurfaced. A stray thought, a memory triggered by something as simple as a song or a scent. But those moments no longer held power over me. They came and went like waves lapping at the shore, unable to erode the ground we had rebuilt. We celebrated milestones together. Anniversaries, birthdays, even the small victories that once might have gone unnoticed. Each one felt like a triumph, a testament to the resilience we'd found within ourselves and each other. One day, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if this hadn't happened?" he asked. I considered his question for a moment, then shook my head. "No," I said honestly, "because if it hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here. And here is where I want to be." He smiled, his eyes softening as he reached for my hand. "Me too," he said. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the rhythmic sound of his breathing, I thought about the journey we'd taken. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been without pain. But it had been worth it. Not because it erased what had happened, but because it showed me what we were capable of when we chose to fight for each other. I didn't know what the future held. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, perhaps even more heartbreak. But I also knew that we were stronger now, more honest, more willing to face those challenges head-on. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As more time passed, I found myself reflecting on what forgiveness truly meant. It wasn't the grand cinematic act of declaring someone absolved. It wasn't a light switch that could be flipped from anger to peace. Forgiveness, I learned, was quieter. It was a daily choice, a willingness to move forward, even when the past whispered in your ear. Some days it came easily, like a gentle tide rolling in. Other days it felt like a battle, a tug-of-war between my heart and my mind. What surprised me most was how much I'd forgiven myself along the way. I hadn't realized how much guilt I'd carried for years, not for his actions, but for the ways I'd neglected my own happiness, for the resentment I'd let simmer beneath the surface. It was easier, in a strange way, to focus on his betrayal than to confront the ways I'd been complicit in the slow unraveling of our connection. Therapy had been a lifeline in those moments, not just for us as a couple but for me as an individual. Through those sessions, I learned to speak my truth without fear, to recognize that my needs and feelings mattered just as much as his. I started saying no to things that didn't serve me, setting boundaries that felt foreign but necessary. It wasn't easy. There were times when I worried that putting myself first would widen the gap between us. But instead, it seemed to bring us closer. He noticed the changes, and instead of pulling away, he leaned in. He started asking questions he'd never asked before. What did I dream about? What scared me? What made me feel alive? First, I didn't know how to answer. Those parts of me felt distant, buried under years of routine and obligation. But slowly, I unearthed them one by one and shared them with him. One evening, as we sat on the couch with a bottle of wine between us, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. If you could do anything, anything at all, what would it be? I hesitated, the question feeling too big, too abstract. I don't know, I admitted. I haven't thought about that in a long time. He smiled, not unkindly. Well, maybe it's time to start. That conversation stayed with me long after the wine was gone and we'd gone to bed. The idea of dreaming again, of imagining a life beyond the one we'd carefully rebuilt, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. What if I dreamed too big? What if I wanted something that didn't include him? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that dreaming didn't have to mean escaping. Could mean expanding, growing together instead of apart. I started making lists, tiny tentative lists of things I wanted to try, places I wanted to see, skills I wanted to learn. He encouraged me every step of the way, even joining me in some of my pursuits. We took a cooking class together, fumbling our way through recipes that left us laughing and covered in flour. We planned weekend getaways to places we'd never explored, rediscovering the joy of adventure. But there were also things I did on my own. I signed up for a yoga class, spent weekends painting in the park, and even joined a book club where I met women who became an unexpected source of strength and camaraderie. For the first time in years, I felt whole not because of him but because of me. And yet he was there, steady and supportive, cheering me on in ways I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't the grand romantic gestures that made the difference. It was the quiet consistency, the way he showed up every day, not just for me but for himself. Our marriage became less about repairing the past and more about creating a future we both wanted to be part of. We talked more, laughed more, and found ways to surprise each other in the small, everyday moments. I started leaving him notes in his lunch, little reminders that I saw him, that I appreciated him. He did the same, tucking messages into the book I was reading or the drawer where I kept my jewelry. One night, as we sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance in the dark, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we're better now?" he asked, his voice soft. I considered his question carefully, watching the way the light from the porch lamp cast shadows across his face. "I think we're different," I said finally. "Not better or worse. Just more honest." He nodded, seeming to understand. "I don't deserve you," he said after a moment. "You don't have to," I replied, reaching for his hand. "You just have to keep showing up." And he did. Day after day, moment by moment, he showed up. Years later, when we celebrated our 20th anniversary, I thought about how far we'd come. The pain that had once defined us felt like a distant memory, a chapter in a story that had grown richer and more complex with time. Our children, two bright, curious souls who had come into our lives after the storm, sat beside us at the table, their laughter filling the room. As I looked around at the life we'd built, I realized that it wasn't perfect. Never would be. But it was ours, and it was beautiful in its imperfection. After the guests had left and the house had grown quiet, he pulled me into his arms and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" I asked, resting my head against his chest. "For believing in us," he said. "For not giving up." I smiled, closing my eyes as the steady rhythm of his heartbeat filled my ears. "You gave me a reason to believe," I said. In that moment, I knew that forgiveness wasn't something I had given him. It was something I had given myself. And it was enough. The years continued to flow like a quiet river, steady and unrelenting. Life wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was a peace to be found in the imperfections. The memory of his betrayal no longer stung like an open wound, though it still lingered in the background, a faint echo of the hurt we had overcome. It had become part of our history, a thread in the fabric of our lives, but it no longer defined us. We grew older, and with age came a kind of clarity that neither of us had possessed in our younger years. The frantic pace of life slowed as we learned to savor the moments we once took for granted. The morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, the quiet walks through the park, the warmth of his hand in mine as we sat on the porch watching the seasons change. These were the things that mattered now. They weren't grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but they were real. They were ours. Our children grew up in a home that, while not free of its past, was built on a foundation of resilience and love. We didn't hide the struggles we had faced from them. Instead, we used them as lessons. When our eldest came to us after a fight with her boyfriend, unsure if their relationship was worth saving, we told her the truth. That love wasn't always easy, that it required work, forgiveness, and a willingness to grow together. She listened, her brow furrowed with thought, and later thanked us for being honest. There were still moments when I would catch myself looking at him, wondering if the pain had been worth it. But those moments were fleeting, drowned out by the weight of all we had built together since. He had become a better man, not just for me but for himself, and that made all the difference. I saw it in the way he treated our children with patience and kindness. I saw it in the way he supported me, whether it was encouraging my passions or simply holding me close on the days when the world felt too heavy. He wasn't perfect, but neither was I. And in our imperfections, we found something that felt like peace. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to me with a look of quiet contentment. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his voice soft. "All the time," I replied, a small smile tugging at my lips. It feels like a lifetime ago. It does, he agreed, his gaze distant as if he were looking back over the years. I think about how close I came to losing you. I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful that you stayed. I didn't stay for you, I said, not unkindly. I stayed for me. For us. Because I believed we could be more than what we were. He reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. And we are, he said. We're so much more. The truth of his words settled over me like a warm blanket. We were more, not just because of the struggle but because of the choice we had made to rebuild. We had taken something broken and created something new, something stronger. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but that was okay. What we had now was real, raw, and honest, and that was enough. As the years turned into decades, we watched our children grow and leave the nest, carving out lives of their own. We celebrated their successes, comforted them in their failures, and reveled in the joy of becoming grandparents. Our house, once filled with the chaos of family life, grew quieter, but it never felt empty. Instead, it felt like a sanctuary, a place where we could reflect on the life we had built together. There were still challenges, of course. Health scares, financial worries, the inevitable trials that come with age. But we faced them together, leaning on each other in ways that had once seemed impossible. He became my rock, my partner in every sense of the word, and I became his. The love we shared wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. One rainy afternoon, as we sat by the fire with mugs of tea in hand, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Regret what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Forgiving me. Giving us another chance." I set my mug down and looked at him, my heart swelling with a mix of love and sadness. "I don't regret it," I said firmly. "Not for a second. Because if I hadn't, we wouldn't be here. And here is exactly where I want to be." He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've earned me," I replied, my voice equally soft. "And I've earned you. We've earned this." The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the beat of my heart. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for him, but for the life we had built together. It hadn't been easy and it hadn't been perfect, but it had been worth it. As we sat there in the quiet, I thought about all the moments that had brought us to this point. The pain, the struggles, the small victories, and the quiet joys. They were all part of our story, a story that was uniquely ours. And as I looked at him, I knew that I wouldn't trade a single page. As the rain continued to patter softly against the windows, I found myself reflecting on the profound changes in our lives. The weight of our shared history was no longer a burden, but a testament to everything we had endured. Each chapter, no matter how painful, had shaped us into the people we were now. The years had softened us, eroded the sharp edges of anger and regret, leaving behind something smoother, more durable. It wasn't just love, it was a quiet understanding, a steady companionship that felt deeper than anything we'd known before. He shifted beside me, his hand still holding mine. I turned to look at him, and the lines on his face seemed more prominent now, etched by time and experience. Yet his eyes, those same eyes I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, still held that spark of warmth and mischief that had first drawn me to him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. I smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "Just everything. How much has changed? How much hasn't?" He chuckled, the sound low and comforting. "It's strange, isn't it? How life can be both completely different and exactly the same." "Strange," I agreed, "but also kind of beautiful." He nodded, and for a moment we simply sat there, letting the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of the rain fill the space between us. There was no need for words. The quiet was enough. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, we settled into a new chapter of our lives. Retirement brought its own set of challenges and opportunities. Without the constant demands of work, we had more time to spend together, but also more time to confront the parts of ourselves we'd ignored in the chaos of raising children and building careers. We rediscovered old hobbies and found new ones. He took up woodworking, spending hours in the garage crafting furniture that was as sturdy and practical as it was beautiful. I continued painting, my studio becoming a sanctuary where I could lose myself in color and creativity. Sometimes he would join me, sitting quietly with a book or offering a gentle critique of my work. "You're getting bolder with your colors," he remarked one afternoon, his voice tinged with admiration. "I like it. It's like you're not afraid of being seen anymore." I paused, the brush hovering over the canvas, and turned to look at him. "Maybe I'm not," I said quietly, surprised by the truth of my own words. He smiled, that familiar, genuine smile that always seemed to light up the room. "Good. You deserve to be seen." His support wasn't the only thing that had changed. I had changed too. The woman I saw in the mirror now was stronger, more confident. She was someone who had faced heartbreak and come out the other side. Someone who had learned to value herself not just as a wife or a mother, but as an individual. There were moments when the past still crept in, uninvited but persistent. Sometimes it was triggered by something as small as a song on the radio or a passing comment from a friend. But those moments no longer had the power to derail me. I had learned to acknowledge them, to let them pass without letting them define me. One evening, as we were sorting through old photo albums, I came across a picture from the early days of our marriage. We were standing on a beach, our arms wrapped around each other, laughing at something I could no longer remember. I studied the image, feeling a pang of nostalgia for the innocence and simplicity of that time. "We were so young," I murmured, tracing my finger over the glossy surface. He leaned over to look at the photo, a soft smile playing on his lips. "We had no idea what we were getting into, did we?" "Not a clue," I said with a laugh. "But I guess that's part of the beauty of it. If we'd known, maybe we wouldn't have been brave enough to try. Or stubborn enough to keep going," he added, his tone light but laced with meaning. I looked at him, the weight of his words settling over me. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing it all?" "Every day," he admitted, his expression serious. "And every day I'm grateful we didn't." His honesty took my breath away, as it so often did now. He had learned to speak from the heart in a way that he hadn't in our earlier years, and it was one of the things I cherished most about this version of him. We continued flipping through the album, each photo a snapshot of a life lived together. There were pictures of birthdays and holidays, vacations and ordinary moments that had somehow felt worth capturing. Each one told a story, a reminder of the journey we'd taken. By the time we reached the last page, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for him but for myself, for the strength it had taken to fight for this life, to believe in it even when it seemed impossible. "Do you think we'll ever stop growing?" I asked as I closed the album. He shook his head, his eyes twinkling with the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived through enough to know better. "I hope not," he said, "because as long as we're growing, we're alive. And as long as we're alive, there's still more to love." His words stayed with me long after we'd gone to bed, the rhythm of his breathing lulling me into a peaceful sleep. In the end, our life wasn't about the dramatic moments or the milestones. It was about the quiet, steady accumulation of love and understanding, the way we chose each other every day, even when it wasn't easy. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful thing of all. The years folded into decades, and our lives settled into a peaceful rhythm. Time, as it does, softened the sharp edges of memory, turning even the most painful moments into lessons, the kind you carry not with bitterness but with understanding. Our children, once the center of our world, had grown into capable, loving adults with lives of their own. They visited often, bringing laughter and stories, and sometimes stayed long enough to fill the quiet house with the chaos of grandchildren. He and I grew older together side by side. The lines on our faces deepened, our movements slowed, but our connection only grew stronger. The bond we had forged in fire and heartbreak was unshakable now, tempered by years of shared love, forgiveness, and rebuilding. One summer evening, as we sat on the porch, the scent of blooming jasmine wafting through the air, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. The setting sun bathed the world in golden light, and the sound of crickets filled the stillness. He was beside me, his hand resting lightly on mine, and I turned to look at him. His hair was silver now, his face lined with age, but his eyes, the same warm, steady eyes that had always held me together, were as bright as ever. He caught me staring and smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting in that familiar, boyish way that made my heart skip even after all these years. "What?" he asked, his tone playful. Nothing, I said, though my voice was thick with emotion. I'm just grateful. For you. For us. For this. His smile softened, and he reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face. I should be the one saying that, he said quietly. You've given me more than I ever deserved. You've shown me what love really means. I shook my head, tears pricking at my eyes. It wasn't just me. We did this together. We chose this. Every single day we chose this. He nodded, his expression serious now. And I'd choose it all over again. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. Because they led us here. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. And for a while we sat in silence, listening to the symphony of the evening. The weight of the past had lifted long ago, leaving only the present, and the present was beautiful. Eventually he spoke again, his voice low but steady. Do you think we'll ever stop choosing each other? I smiled, my heart full. Not even when this life is over, I said. I'll find you in the next one, and we'll do it all again. He squeezed my hand, his grip still as strong as it had been on the day we first held hands so many years ago. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what the future held, we had already won. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, I leaned my head against his shoulder, and we sat together, wrapped in the quiet certainty of a love that had endured.